Proofread everything you write. Chapter 4, Errors in English. Okay, so the chapter talks about reading versus proofreading and the difference and why that difference is important. So when we read, we only see the outlines of words. It's how the brain interprets what we see on the page. For instance, this graphic I've put on the slide, right? It's all jumbled up, but I can still read it. So let me demonstrate that. According to research, that's funny, it should just be research, but according to research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be at the right place. The rest can be a total mess and you can still read it without problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. Right? So what are the implications of this? What does this mean to your paper? Well, in my view, it means that we can easily miss obvious errors when we're reading through our own papers. Again, this means that you have to be much more careful when you're proofreading than when you're reading. Sometimes you're skimming the words and the brain is sorting out the context for you. So there's what the page reads, and then there's what your brain interprets or assumes that the page reads. So this does not mean you're a bad person or dumb or, if any of these issues, if you have errors in your paper. It just means that you need to flex your proofreading muscle because it takes practice to develop good proofreading skills. It's not something you should just be able to do. It's like anything else. You get much better at it with practice. So really, when you understand that we're working almost against our brain when it comes to proofreading, then you can get rid of any of the kind of emotional attachments to not being immediately good at it and just kind of move towards the practice of crafting it in your own papers. So finding errors. It's much easier to find errors in someone else's paper than in your own paper. This is just a fact, especially if you've not practiced proofreading your papers in college. When you read someone else's paper, sometimes the errors just pop out at you, or they seem obvious. Whether it's spelling issues, grammar issues, or even sentence structure issues, you can see them in other people's papers in an easy way that may not translate to your own paper as easily. So what are the reasons for this? Well, first, you're more careful when you're reading other people's papers. We're thinking more carefully about the words and the content and the arguments when we read someone else's paper. When we read our own papers, in draft after draft, we know what we're trying to argue. We've constructed those sentences with particular words with meanings that make sense to us, or at least they did when we wrote that draft. So when looking at someone else's paper, it makes sense you would be more careful. Another reason it's easier to find errors in someone else's paper is that you're looking for mistakes when reading through someone else's paper, which we often neglect to do when we read through our own papers. We also may be more careful because we're unfamiliar with the content. So we have to slowly and methodically read through a paper to figure out what it's saying, how it is using research to demonstrate the points of its paper. So if something is spelled wrong, or even if a concept is not fully illustrated or explained, that's something that will stand out to you when you're reading someone else's paper, but that might not have that same effect when you're reading through your own paper. This is why developing the skill of proofreading and careful revising can help you when you apply it to your own paper, which is why you're doing a peer review in this course, in hopes that what you learn from that process, you can apply to your own paper, to the edits, before you have your final paper submission. Okay, so continuing with finding errors. So when it comes to finding errors in our own papers, we know our own topic, so it's easier to miss the sometimes blatant mistakes. This can be a very frustrating fact, right? Which is why proofreading is something we should practice to refine that ability. But there are other solutions for the issue of not seeing errors in your own paper. You can use peer editing, kind of like the peer review you do for this course. You can have a fellow classmate read your paper, or a work colleague, or just another person that's, generally studying sociology, because they'll be able to see the mistakes and issues in your paper more readily since it's new to them. This could be an exchange. So while you're doing a peer review for this class, I want to encourage you to do this with future paper submissions and other courses. Pretty much every class, unless it's like a lab class or something, makes you write a long-ass research paper or other essay of sorts to demonstrate your comprehension of course concepts and materials. So it's always helpful whether it be for the major paper in this course or just even a reaction paper like in my social inequalities class, right? Having someone else read it is so helpful. Apply their feedback when you're revising and you'll be so much happier with the paper that you end up with. So as I said, it can be an exchange. I have a colleague who formed a peer writing group when she was in graduate school, and even though that was over 15 years ago, she still periodically meets with the group virtually. Even though they're all PhD-carrying full-time professors, they still rely on each other to look through drafts before they submit research proposals, because that extra pair of eyes means everything when it comes to producing a great paper. So don't feel like it's only you that needs that kind of help or support. We all do. I wish I had a writing group like my colleague, because I love my grad school homies, but not all of them are super great at being meticulous in their writing, and that's what I am when I read their papers. So I've helped a lot of my friends and colleagues with their dissertations, theses, other work, because what are friends for if not for reading your dissertation? So while you're a student, there are also university resources you have access to that you pay for through your student fees, which is another reason to take advantage of these resources. There's the sociology department writing tutor, who's a graduate student that can help you with each stage of the paper. I highly recommend scheduling an appointment with the sociology writing tutor. I myself was the writing tutor when I was getting my master's in sociology at Cal State Fullerton, so I feel it's my job to pay that forward and tell you to go bug that tutor. There's also tutors at the University Learning Center, which can help you more generally because they're often not sociologists necessarily, but often the kinds of errors you're missing in your paper are often easy fixes like grammar, spelling, logic errors, or maybe even just omissions of information. So the tutors there are equipped to find those issues in your paper. And then, of course, there's always friends and family, who I suggest bugging to help you. I do this with my husband, who will begrudgingly read my stuff and find the little things that I looked right past when I read it. The people in your life can be a resource for you, even if they have no sociological training. That can actually be helpful sometimes to get a sort of outsider view that means they see when concepts are not really explained or theories are not fully elaborated. A person like me reading the paper would see you talking about Marx or Goffman and be like, oh, I see where they're going with this. Where someone not as familiar with them would ask for clarification, which can be an important revision. So we want to produce accessible papers to those outside of academia and for those, that are really outside of the discipline of sociology, so they can read it and still understand what the arguments are and really have the takeaway from your paper. Okay, so back to the idea of proofreading instead of reading. So we detect careless errors, not by reading, but by proofreading. So you have to take the time and really commit to proofreading. Sometimes this means reading each sentence or paragraphs a few times, or maybe reading a whole section aloud. That always helps me, as I can sometimes hear the errors aloud that I'm missing when I'm reading the page. So take the time and practice proofreading, and you will get better at it. It's such a valuable tool in school, but it's also a very important tool for later in life, right? Because you don't want to sound dumb or lazy or unprepared, but that can be the impression someone gets from your writing when it's not proofread or it's not revised well, right? Because they take that as an indication of your interest or ability. An important thing to remember is that your proofreading speed should not outpace your regular reading speed. Maybe even less than half the speed your proofreading speed should be, right? So you can carefully consider the grammar, spelling, sentence structure, and of course the argument and the context and overall fit of the sections of your paper. Do not expect it to take as long as it takes to read the paper once. You need to spend more time proofreading if you want an effective paper. Okay, so there's also some information in the book about proofreading marks. So proofreading shorthand can be helpful in revising another person's paper. You do not need to know these marks. I'm not going to test you on them or anything, but you do need to know what the errors are that they're referring to. So again, these can be helpful shorthand for, very common errors that you'll see in editing other papers and really your own as well. I stopped using these mostly as I now use track changes in Word. So again, whether it's about revising someone else's draft, or for quickness when proofreading your own paper, proofreading marks can be very helpful to understand. So there is, if you want to know more about these proofreading marks, you can reference page 25 in your Errors in English book for more examples of the appropriate marks and really what errors they're trying to fix in your paper drafts.